In the beginning there was nothing. Only darkness, deep and endless. A void, silent and still. The world had yet to take shape, and time itself had yet to begin. There were no stars, no sky, no mountains, no oceans. Just emptiness, infinite and silent. There was no land to tread upon, no horizon to gaze at. Everything was a blank canvas, untouched by form or color. A great emptiness hung in the air, waiting for purpose, waiting for life. And then, out of the silence, a sound, a voice. A voice that was not like any sound we know, for it held within it the power to shape, to create, to command. It was the voice of God. It did not just break the silence, it transformed it. The first word spoken into the void was not just a sound, it was a command, a declaration of existence. The voice of God pierced the stillness, and with it, light flooded into the darkness. The light was not just illumination, it was the first revelation of life. It was the beginning of creation itself. "Let there be light," God spoke, and instantly the world was bathed in brilliance. The light shattered the darkness, pushing it back, revealing the contours of the world that was beginning to emerge. The void was no longer empty, it was now filled with purpose, with possibility, with potential. The light stretched across the vastness, cutting through the eternal night, marking the beginning of time itself. For the first time there was something to behold, something to witness. As the light took shape, God began to separate the elements. He separated the waters from the dry land, calling forth the oceans and seas to flow and settle, and the land to emerge and rise from the depths of the abyss. The dry earth, formed in perfect design, began to take shape. Mountains, great and towering, rose from the sea, their peaks kissed by the newly formed sky. Valleys and plains spread out, stretching far and wide, waiting to be filled with life. The heavens above were created, vast and endless. The stars, the sun, and the moon were set in their places by God's command, each with its own purpose, to mark the days and the nights, to guide the seasons, and to bring order to the world. The sun was placed to rule over the day, casting its golden light upon the earth, while the moon and stars were set to shine by night, casting their soft light upon the world below. The sky itself was a tapestry of limitless blue, stretching far beyond what the eye could see, marking the boundary between the earth below and the heavens above. Every piece of creation was purposeful. God formed the earth with intention, shaping it not just to exist, but to thrive. The rivers began to flow, their waters winding through the land, nourishing the soil, carrying life where it was needed. Trees began to sprout, their roots digging deep into the earth, their branches reaching up towards the sky, laden with fruits and leaves. Every corner of creation was infused with life, from the smallest blade of grass to the tallest mountain. The world was not only filled with beauty but with meaning. Each element, each living thing was created with purpose. Now close your eyes and imagine this scene. Picture a world that is not yet formed, a great void, an endless darkness. And then, from that darkness, a voice, powerful, commanding, and full of life, speaks and everything changes. The first light pierces the blackness, cutting through it like a blade, revealing the world in all its raw, unshaped beauty. Imagine the first rays of light breaking through the endless night, giving birth to the world as we know it. The earth begins to take form. The seas parting from the land, great mountains rising from the depths of the abyss, valleys opening up wide to receive the waters. The sky above stretches infinitely, filled with stars, the sun, and the moon, each placed in their perfect place by the hand of the Creator. The waters begin to flow, rivers winding through the earth, bringing life to every corner, every crevice. The trees begin to grow, their roots deep in the earth, their branches reaching for the heavens. The world, once formless and void, is now filled with purpose, beauty, and life. Every mountain, every river, every tree, every blade of grass, all of it was intentional. Each element was crafted by God with purpose, reflecting His glory. This was the world God had created, a world meant to reflect His greatness, His creativity, and His love. It was a paradise waiting to be filled with life, with meaning, and with His presence. After the earth had been formed, God planted a garden in the east, a special place where life would flourish in perfect harmony, the Garden of Eden. This was not just any garden. It was the epitome of paradise, the very pinnacle of creation. Picture it, a vast, lush expanse, rich with life and beauty, where everything was perfectly ordered according to God's design. The ground was fertile, and the earth teemed with life in every direction. The air was heavy with the fragrance of countless flowers, each one bursting with color, vivid reds, radiant purples, and soft yellows, all alive and vibrant. The scent of sweet blossoms mixed with the earthy aroma of the rich soil beneath, creating a natural perfume that filled the entire garden. Every step you took in Eden felt like walking through the heart of creation itself. Trees of every kind stood tall, their trunks thick and sturdy, their leaves dense and glossy. They stretched toward the heavens, their branches dancing in the breeze. Each tree was different, but all were beautiful. Some bore fruit that shimmered in the sunlight, others were adorned with fragrant flowers, while others provided shade, offering shelter from the warmth of the sun. The trees didn't just serve as decoration, they were filled with purpose, offering fruit that would sustain, flowers that would bloom, and shade that would refresh. The rivers of Eden wound through the land like veins of life, cutting through the garden in perfect, winding paths. The water sparkled under the sun, pure and clear, nourishing the land as it flowed, carrying life wherever it went. The rivers brought life to the plants and trees, they fed the roots and the soil, and in turn they provided a space for animals to drink and cool themselves. The sound of the flowing water was peaceful, like a soft lullaby, and it blended with the songs of the birds that flew overhead, creating a symphony of sound that echoed throughout the garden. The air was not just fresh, it was alive. It was filled with the hum of nature, the soft rustling of the leaves, the chirping of birds, the gentle movement of the animals, and the sound of the wind weaving its way through the branches. Everything in the garden was connected, each part working in harmony with the others, perfectly balanced. The animals roamed freely, unafraid of one another, in a peaceful coexistence that no longer exists in the world today. The lion walked side by side with the lamb, the deer grazed peacefully beneath the trees, and birds fluttered between branches, singing their joyful songs. There was no fear, no predation, no hunger. Every creature in Eden was free, living in perfect harmony with each other and with the world they inhabited. In this paradise there was no suffering, there was no decay, there was no death. Everything was made to thrive, to flourish, to live. The garden was a sanctuary, a place where peace reigned, where every blade of grass, every flower, every tree and animal was a reflection of God's love, goodness, and creativity. Eden was far more than just a garden. It was a tangible reflection of God's boundless goodness, His infinite creativity, and His desire to create a world where life could flourish in its purest form. Every corner of the garden was filled with purpose and beauty, each tree and flower perfectly placed to add to the overall harmony of creation. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms, so fresh, so pure, it was like inhaling the very essence of life itself. The trees, majestic, tall, and full of fruit, stood as sentinels, each one unique, yet all part of the beautiful whole that was Eden. In Eden there was no suffering, no decay. The air was warm but not too hot. The rivers ran clear, nourishing every inch of land, and in turn the land gave back abundantly. The animals roamed freely, in perfect peace, without fear of one another, without the hunger or need that would later plague the world outside Eden. It was a world of perfect balance and abundance, untouched by sin, untouched by death. Every living thing in Eden was created to thrive, to live in harmony with the others around it. Eden was a paradise meant for one purpose, to be inhabited by life. A place where creation could flourish, where beauty could be enjoyed, and where the creatures of the earth could live in perfect peace with each other and with God. In this garden, the boundaries of time seemed to fade away. It was a world of eternal life, where every moment felt like a gift. It was a place where the Creator's heart was reflected in every leaf, in every stream, and in every living creature that called the garden home. God, in His infinite wisdom, shaped Adam from the very dust of the earth. Imagine this, the earth, rich and fertile, brimming with potential, as God's hand molded Adam with a divine purpose. The Creator took the soil from the earth, and from it, He formed the shape of the first man. The very earth from which Adam was formed now contained within it the divine spark of life. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the Creator's final touch. And then God breathed life into Adam. The first breath ever taken by a human. It was not just air entering the lungs of the first man, it was the divine breath, the essence of God Himself, filling Adam's body with life. As Adam's chest rose with that first breath, the world around him seemed to awaken. The trees rustled as if acknowledging his arrival. The river flowed more purposefully, as if joining in the celebration of his existence. The animals too seemed to pause as if in reverence of the first human life. God placed Adam in the heart of the garden, not merely to live but to thrive, to tend and care for the garden that had been created for him. The garden was beautiful, lush, and perfect, but it was not meant to remain passive. It needed a steward, someone to care for it, someone to bring it to its fullest potential. Adam's task was not one of mindless labor, but one of purpose. He was to be the gardener, the caretaker, the guardian of this paradise. God entrusted Adam with the sacred responsibility of cultivating the garden, of nurturing it and helping it flourish as it was meant to. In the garden, Adam was given dominion, not just over the plants and trees but over all the creatures of the earth. God brought the animals to Adam to be named. Can you imagine that moment? Each creature, from the towering elephant to the tiniest butterfly, was presented to Adam, and he, with great purpose and understanding, named them. With each name, Adam recognized the uniqueness of each creation and understood its role in the harmony of Eden. He wasn't just naming animals, he was participating in the creative act of God. He was reflecting the Creator's wisdom and creativity in a way that was uniquely human. Adam, though made from the earth, was also made in the image of God. He was more than just a physical being, he was a being with intellect, with emotion, and with a spirit capable of relationship. His heart and mind were perfectly designed to understand the world around him, to reflect the Creator's greatness, and to walk in harmony with the divine. Unlike the animals, Adam had the ability to reason, to create, and to choose. He was the only creature in all of Eden who was made to reflect God's image, to know, to love, and to care for the world in a way no other creature could. Adam was not just the first man, he was the first being to reflect the image of God in a way that no other creature could. Formed from the very earth, yet filled with the divine breath, Adam was the first of God's creation to walk the earth in perfect harmony with the world around him. God breathed life into him, and in that moment, Adam became more than just flesh. He became a living being, capable of reflecting the divine image in everything he did. Placed in the garden, Adam's role was far more than simply existing. God did not place him in paradise to sit idly by, but to engage in the work of creation. Adam's task was to cultivate the garden, to tend it, to care for it, and to help it flourish. He was the gardener of Eden, the one entrusted with the task of ensuring that this perfect world would continue to thrive under his care. His relationship with the garden was not just one of work, but of love. Adam was given dominion over all living things, but that dominion was not one of control or exploitation. It was one of stewardship, of nurturing. God gave Adam the responsibility to name the creatures of the earth, from the mighty lion to the gentle lamb, from the soaring eagle to the buzzing bee. With each name, Adam not only gave each animal its identity but also recognized their unique place in God's design. It was as if Adam was reflecting God's creative act by naming and understanding his creatures, becoming part of the ongoing act of creation. Created in God's image, Adam was not just given the responsibility to care for the earth but to reflect the nature of the Creator. His heart, his mind, his spirit, all were designed to understand, reflect, and interact with the world in a way that mirrored the Creator's own work. God did not just create Adam to exist. He created him to engage with life, to cultivate it, to help it grow and flourish, and to live in perfect harmony with the Creator, the garden, and the creatures that walked alongside him. Adam walked through the garden, his steps light upon the soft earth, each footfall resonating with a sense of peace and purpose. The world around him was nothing short of breathtaking. The trees stood tall and majestic, their branches heavy with vibrant fruit, and the flowers bloomed in an explosion of colors, their fragrances wafting through the air, filling the garden with life. The rivers wound through the land like veins of life, their crystal-clear waters sparkling in the sunlight. Birds of every hue sang their melodious songs from the trees, and the animals roamed freely, each in its own place, living in perfect harmony. The garden was alive with sound, with color, with movement. Yet, despite the beauty surrounding him, Adam could not shake the quiet ache that settled deep within his soul. He was surrounded by the wonders of creation, but there was still something missing. The trees, the rivers, the animals, they were beautiful, they were purposeful, but they were not enough. He walked alone. As he moved through the garden, his eyes would linger on the animals that roamed beside him. The majestic lion that walked with quiet dignity, the playful deer that bounded gracefully through the grass, the birds that flew from tree to tree in perfect synchrony, all of them were living, breathing creatures full of life, but none of them could meet Adam where he was. None of them could share his thoughts, his feelings, his experiences. None of them could understand the deeper stirrings of his heart. Though Adam stood amidst all the beauty the world had to offer, something inside him stirred with longing. The trees, the flowers, the animals, they were beautiful, yes. They were filled with life and purpose, each playing its part in the grand design of the garden. The rivers flowed with crystal-clear waters, nourishing the land, and the birds filled the air with their joyful songs. But none of these could speak to the longing in Adam's heart. Adam was created in the image of God, and within him was a deep yearning for connection, for companionship, for someone who could understand him. someone who could share in the wonder of this world and walk beside him in perfect harmony. The animals, though wonderful and beautiful, were not his equal. They could not speak to him in the way his heart needed. They could not reflect his thoughts, his hopes, or his dreams. Adam would often find himself pausing, gazing at the vast horizon, the endless beauty of the garden stretching out before him. The golden light of the sun would bathe everything in its warmth, casting long shadows as the day shifted into evening. But even in these perfect moments, when everything around him seemed to sing in perfect harmony, there was a quiet ache in his chest. It was a feeling that was neither physical nor of the world around him, but a spiritual longing deep in his soul. He had been entrusted with the garden, to name the animals, to tend to the land, to care for the world around him. He had been given dominion over all that was created. And yet, there was a part of him that longed for more. He needed someone to share this responsibility with, someone to stand beside him as an equal, someone to witness the beauty of the world alongside him. He needed a companion, a partner who could understand him and walk with him in a way the animals could not. As Adam gazed out over the garden, with its endless beauty and abundance, something deep within him stirred. The golden light of the sun bathed the earth, casting long shadows as the evening drew near, and still, there was that quiet ache within his heart. He had everything: beauty, peace, purpose. And yet, none of it filled the emptiness he felt inside. The world was perfect, but his soul was incomplete. He had been made for something more, for something deeper. He needed someone who could walk beside him in this perfect world, someone who could share in the beauty, the responsibility, the wonder of creation. Even in paradise, Adam could not escape the longing for companionship, for connection. He had dominion over the earth, but no one with whom to share it. The animals, though they roamed beside him, could not speak to him. They could not understand his heart, nor could they share in the deeper reflections and desires that stirred within him. Adam needed a companion, someone who could not only stand beside him in the garden, but who could understand him, laugh with him, share in the beauty and complexity of creation. There were times when Adam would sit by the river, watching the water flow gently over the rocks, feeling the cool breeze on his skin, and yet he still felt a distance between himself and the world around him. He longed to share this moment with someone who could truly understand. Someone who would sit beside him in silence, enjoying the peace of the garden, not just as a caretaker but as a partner. The animals had their roles to play. They were vital to the balance of the world, but none could walk beside Adam as an equal. None could reflect the shared purpose that he longed for. Even in the beauty of Eden, where everything seemed perfect, there was an inner restlessness in Adam. His soul, created in God's image, yearned for connection, for a companionship that transcended the world of animals and plants around him. Adam's heart, though surrounded by the beauty of the world, was restless. He would sit by the river and watch the water flow over the stones, the sun setting in the distance, the golden light reflecting off the surface of the water. The moment was perfect, yet still there was that ache deep within his chest. It was a longing for connection. A desire to share this beauty with someone who could understand, someone who could walk beside him and share in the wonder of the world they inhabited. Though the animals filled the garden, they could not fill the emptiness he felt. He needed someone who could see him, not just as a caretaker of the garden, but as a person, as a soul yearning for deeper connection. The animals had their beauty, their purpose, but they could not meet Adam where he was. They could not understand his heart. And in that, Adam realized the truth. He was meant for more than the solitude of Eden. He was meant to share it with another, someone who could walk beside him and help him fulfill the purpose God had set for them both. In the stillness of the garden, after Adam's longing for companionship had stirred in his heart, God saw that it was not good for man to be alone. Though the world around Adam was filled with beauty and life, there was no one to walk alongside him, no one who could share in the magnificence of creation as he could. Adam had a purpose, a responsibility to tend the garden and care for the earth, but there was a deep, unspoken yearning within him for a partner. Someone who could reflect his heart, share in his purpose, and be his equal in every way. And so, in his divine wisdom, God decided to create for Adam a companion who would complement him perfectly. Adam was put into a deep, peaceful sleep, a sleep that would allow God to work with tender care. As Adam lay unconscious, God reached into his very being and took one of his ribs, carefully molding it and shaping it into the first woman. It was not just a physical creation. God formed Eve with great intention, breathing into her the breath of life just as he had done with Adam. She was formed with a perfect balance of strength and beauty, intelligence and grace, a reflection of God's divine artistry. Eve was not just a woman in the sense of physical form, but in her, God instilled the essence of companionship, nurturing, and partnership. She was made to reflect the same image of God as Adam, yet she was uniquely different. She would be the one to walk beside him, to be his equal, to share in the joys and responsibilities of the life they would build together. From the very side of Adam, God created Eve, not from the dust of the earth as he had done with Adam, but from his very flesh, from the part of him that would remind him of her closeness, her equality, and her importance in the grand design. Eve was formed with the utmost care, as if God himself had taken the time to mold her with a perfect balance of grace and strength. She was not just a companion, not just another creature in the garden. She was his equal, created to walk beside him in perfect harmony. As Adam lay sleeping, the earth seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what would come. God did not merely create Eve to fill a void. He created her to be the reflection of Adam's heart, the missing part of his soul. She was not an afterthought, not a mere helper. She was made with intention, with purpose, to be one with Adam in all things. God's design was perfect. From Adam's side, Eve was brought into being, not to be above him, not beneath him, but beside him. Together, they would be partners in the stewardship of the garden, in the fulfillment of the divine purpose God had set before them. They were meant to be co-creators, not just in the physical sense but in the spiritual sense. Partners in life, partners in love, partners in purpose. When Adam awoke, the garden around him still felt familiar, yet there was something new. There was a presence, a sense of completion that filled the air. As his eyes opened and focused, he saw her, Eve. She stood before him, her beauty radiating in the soft light of the garden, her eyes filled with understanding and recognition. Her presence was not just a pleasant surprise, it was a revelation. The moment Adam saw Eve, he knew. He knew in his very being that she was made for him, that she was the answer to the longing he had felt within his heart. There was no confusion in Adam's heart. There was no hesitation. He saw her, and he instantly recognized her as the one meant to walk beside him. She was not a stranger in the garden. She was the missing part of his soul, the companion his heart had ached for. The perfect partnership was now complete. Together, Adam and Eve were united, one in purpose, one in love, one in mission. When Adam first saw Eve, there was no confusion, no hesitation in his heart. It was as though the moment their eyes met, everything clicked into place. It was as though his soul recognized her, as though she was the missing part of him that he had longed for, but never knew how to name. She was not just another creature in the garden. She was the one who could share in the beauty of creation, the one who could understand his heart, the one who could walk beside him in every step of the journey God had set before them. In that moment, Adam's heart knew. She was made for him. The harmony of Eden, once perfect, was now complete. Together, they would share the responsibility of tending the garden, of cultivating the earth, of caring for the life that filled it. But their unity was not just about work. It was about love. It was about companionship. It was about the bond that would exist between them, a bond that reflected the love and partnership that God himself shared with his creation. God had created them to be one, to reflect his image, to live in harmony, to love one another in the way he loved them. Together, Adam and Eve were more than just man and woman. They were co-creators, stewards of the earth, partners in the divine plan. In each other, they found their purpose, their place in the perfect world that God had created for them. In the heart of Eden, Adam and Eve walked side by side, their steps synchronized as they moved through the lush garden. With each step, the earth seemed to hum in rhythm with their presence. The sounds of the garden, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the gentle flow of rivers, were like a song that welcomed them, as if the world itself was alive, reflecting the perfect unity they shared. There was no separation, no distance between them and the world. Everything was interconnected, and in this oneness they found their purpose. The animals roamed freely around them, some walking alongside them, others playing in the grass or drinking from the clear waters of the rivers. Adam and Eve were not strangers to the creatures of the garden. They were their companions. Each animal, each plant, each tree was a part of the world they had been entrusted to care for. The creatures of the earth were at peace, and the air around them was filled with an unmistakable sense of joy, a joy that emanated from the perfect harmony that existed in the garden. The trees, with their abundant fruits, stood tall and full of life, their branches reaching toward the sky as though they were worshiping the Creator. The rivers flowed gently through the land, their waters nourishing everything in their path. The flowers bloomed in brilliant colors, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. Every part of the garden was a reflection of the perfect order and beauty that God had intended. Adam and Eve shared this beauty together, their bond stronger with each passing moment. Their hearts beat in sync with the rhythm of creation, their love not just for one another, but for the world they were entrusted to care for. They worked together, side by side, tending the garden, naming the creatures, ensuring that the world remained in its perfect state of balance. But their work was not burdensome. It was a joyous collaboration with God and with the world around them. Their work, their love, and their purpose were all intertwined, reflecting the Creator's image in every act, every word, and every movement. They were stewards of the earth, not rulers in the conventional sense, but caretakers, nurturers, protectors of the world that had been created for them. There was no conflict, no struggle for control. They were in perfect harmony with each other and with the earth. The garden was theirs to explore, to enjoy, to care for, and to nurture, but it was also their place of peace and unity. They had been given this gift, and together they tended to it with love and gratitude. Together, Adam and Eve were not merely companions, not just two individuals walking through Eden. They were partners in the grand work of creation. Every step they took in the garden was in perfect harmony with the world around them, each movement synchronized with the rhythm of life that flowed through the earth. Their bond was deeper than just love for each other. It was a reflection of the unity that God had intended, a unity not just between them but between all of creation. Their love was not confined to each other alone. It extended to the garden, to the animals, to the earth, and to the Creator Himself. The animals, the trees, the rivers, they were all a part of the world Adam and Eve had been entrusted to care for. Together, they were stewards of this perfect world, working side by side to ensure its flourishing. But their stewardship was not one of domination. It was one of reverence, of partnership. They nurtured the world not with a sense of ownership, but with a deep love for all that God had created. They worked with the earth, not against it, bringing forth life, harmony, and beauty in every action. As they walked together through the garden, the peace and joy of the world around them reflected in their hearts. Every tree, every blade of grass, every creature was part of the song of creation, and Adam and Eve were the ones who, with God, orchestrated that song. They were not alone. They were one with each other, with the garden, and with the Creator. Their love was an expression of the perfect unity that existed between them, a unity that reflected the love and harmony God had designed for them to live in. Adam and Eve together reflected the image of God in the most beautiful way. Their love, their purpose, their work, all intertwined, all in perfect harmony. In the garden, they found not just peace with each other, but peace with the world and peace with God. They were the caretakers of Eden, but they were also its children, entrusted with the task of nurturing and protecting the paradise God had so carefully designed. In the heart of the Garden of Eden, surrounded by beauty and perfection, God gave Adam and Eve one simple command. The garden, with all its abundance, was theirs to enjoy, every tree, every plant, every river, and every animal. There was no lack, no limitation, nothing standing in the way of their enjoyment of God's perfect creation. Yet, in the middle of this paradise stood one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This tree was unlike any other. Its branches reached high into the sky, its fruit gleaming in the sunlight as if it were calling out to be noticed, to be taken. The tree was beautiful, its fruit as enticing and perfect as any other, yet it carried with it a command from God, a simple rule: you may eat from any tree in the garden, except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. God had given Adam and Eve the entire world to enjoy, but this one tree was forbidden. It stood in the center of the garden, not because it was inherently evil, but because it represented something far deeper, a choice. It was not the tree itself that was dangerous, but the act of choosing to take from it. God's command was clear: they were not to eat from it. It was a boundary set by the Creator, a limit that would define their relationship with Him. The tree, however, was not an ugly or dangerous one. It was not poisonous or twisted, and it did not bear thorns or deadly fruit. It was, in fact, beautiful and inviting. Its fruit shimmered in the sunlight, and from its branches, a gentle breeze would carry the scent of sweetness through the air. The temptation was not in the tree's appearance, nor in the fruit itself, but in the allure of what it promised. This tree was different. It was not just another part of the garden. It represented something beyond the boundaries of God's design. It represented a choice that was central to Adam and Eve's role as creatures made in God's image. Amid the beauty and abundance of the garden, where every tree bore fruit and every animal was at peace, there stood one tree, a singular boundary in a world full of freedom. God had given Adam and Eve everything, the entire world, a paradise overflowing with beauty, peace, and purpose. There was no lack, no need, no pain. Everything was perfect. And yet, there was one rule, one simple command: do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The tree itself was not dangerous, nor was it ugly. It was not twisted or grotesque. In fact, it was beautiful, its fruit gleaming like gold in the sunlight, its branches stretching high toward the heavens. It called to them, tempting them with its allure. The tree was a part of the garden, a reflection of God's creativity, and yet it was set apart. It represented a choice, the most important choice they would ever make. Would they trust God's wisdom, His command, and the abundance He had already provided? Or would they reach beyond what was given, desiring something more, something that was never meant for them? The temptation wasn't in the tree itself. It wasn't in the fruit, which was as good as any other in the garden. The temptation was in the choice to step outside of the harmony that God had created, to decide for themselves what was good and evil. The tree was a symbol of that choice. A choice that would define their relationship with God. A choice that would determine the course of history. The question was not about the tree. It was about their willingness to trust in God's wisdom, or to seek for themselves the knowledge that had been kept from them. As Adam and Eve walked through the garden, they must have noticed the tree, and they may have wondered about it. It was there, right in the middle of their perfect world. It stood waiting. But it wasn't just a tree. It was a reminder that God had given them everything they could ever need or want, and yet there was one thing that was not for them. One tree that, if eaten from, would bring about a change so profound it would alter everything they knew. God did not forbid them from eating from the tree because it was evil in itself. The tree was not inherently bad or wicked. But it represented something far deeper, the choice to defy God's command, to reach beyond the bounds He had set for them, and to take something for themselves that was not meant for them. It represented the choice of self-reliance over trust in the Creator. God's command was not about the tree itself. The tree was not evil. It was not twisted or harmful by nature. No, the tree represented the choice. The choice to trust God and obey His word, or the choice to decide for themselves what was good and evil. The tree was not dangerous because of its fruit. It was dangerous because of what it represented, the temptation to reach for something that was not meant for them. God had already given them everything. The entire garden, filled with its beauty and abundance, was theirs to enjoy. But the tree was different. It was the one place in the entire world where God had set a boundary, a rule that marked the line between trust and rebellion. The tree was a test of trust, a test of obedience. The choice was simple yet profound. Would Adam and Eve trust in God's wisdom, in His design, or would they reach for something more? Something beyond the Creator's good and perfect plan. The moment Adam and Eve stood before the tree, the weight of the choice must have seemed overwhelming. The fruit was inviting, beautiful, no different from the other fruits they had eaten from in the garden. The difference was that this fruit carried with it the knowledge of good and evil. It promised understanding, wisdom, and power, the very things that made the tree so tempting. The fruit called out to them, whispering of things they didn't yet understand, things they were being kept from. It beckoned with the promise of wisdom, of becoming like God Himself. Would they trust in the Creator's wisdom and remain in the harmony He had designed, or would they seek to define good and evil for themselves, taking the knowledge He had withheld from them? The fruit of the tree was no different from the other fruit they had enjoyed in the garden. It was beautiful, inviting, sweet, but it carried with it a promise. The promise of knowledge, of wisdom, of power. The tree represented the desire for more. It was not the fruit itself that was dangerous, but the choice it offered. Would Adam and Eve remain in the harmony of creation, trusting the Creator's design? Or would they step outside of that trust, reaching for something more, something that was never meant for them? The temptation was not in the fruit, but in the choice. The choice to step beyond the boundaries God had set for them, to define for themselves what was good and evil, to seek knowledge that was not theirs to have. The question was never about the tree. It was about whether they would trust God's wisdom, His perfect plan, or whether they would choose to seek something beyond what had been given to them. The air in the garden was warm, filled with the rustling of leaves and the soft hum of life. The perfect harmony of Eden was palpable, yet in the midst of this tranquility, there was something slithering quietly through the grass, a creature unlike any other in the garden. The serpent. But it was no ordinary serpent. This one was cunning, clever, and filled with an ancient intelligence that seemed to permeate the air around it. Its movements were smooth, deliberate, and it moved with an unsettling grace, as if it knew something that the rest of the world did not. The serpent was not just a creature, it was a voice, a force, a presence that would disrupt the peace of the garden. Its very existence was part of a deeper, darker plan, one that would set into motion a choice that would change the world forever. It found Eve alone, walking near the tree of knowledge. There was no immediate danger. The serpent did not appear with fangs bared or threats in its eyes. Instead, it came to her quietly, almost familiarly. Its eyes gleamed with a knowing intelligence, and when it spoke, its voice was smooth and silken, almost hypnotic. "Did God really say you shall not eat from every tree in the garden?" the serpent asked. Its voice was soft, subtle, like the gentle rustling of leaves. It wasn't an outright confrontation, but a question, a suggestion. The serpent didn't accuse God. It didn't challenge his authority directly. Instead, it made Eve question the very words God had spoken. The question wasn't about whether the tree was forbidden, it was about whether God's command was truly for their good. It planted a seed of doubt in Eve's mind. Did God really mean what he said? The serpent didn't come with threats, sharp words, or accusations. It came with questions. It asked, "Did God really say you shall not eat from every tree in the garden?" The serpent didn't directly attack God's command. No, it was far more subtle. It was as if it was testing Eve's trust in God, planting a seed of doubt where there had once been certainty. The question wasn't about the tree itself. It was about God's word. The serpent was inviting Eve to question not just the command, but the very goodness of the one who gave it. It was an insidious tactic. By asking Eve to reconsider God's words, the serpent didn't challenge God outright. It simply made her wonder, was God truly looking out for them? Was there more to this world than they had been told? The serpent's words didn't scream of rebellion. They whispered of uncertainty, of something hidden, of something more that might be waiting just beyond the boundary God had set. The serpent continued, its words dripping with persuasion. "You won't die," it said, its voice coaxing, warm with promise. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." The serpent's voice was not forceful, but sweet, comforting, as though it was offering her a secret truth, something she had been kept from. It promised knowledge, enlightenment, power. To Eve, the tree had once seemed like something forbidden, something off limits. But now, through the serpent's words, it seemed to represent something more, something she had been denied, something that would make her more than what she was. The fruit was no longer just a piece of forbidden food. It was the key to something greater. The serpent didn't need to entice her with fear. It enticed her with the idea of becoming like God, of knowing what God knew. The serpent didn't simply invite Eve to eat the fruit. It invited her to see the world differently. It didn't promise harm or destruction. It promised enlightenment. The serpent's words were insidious, wrapped in comfort and familiarity. It spoke of knowledge, of understanding, of becoming more, of becoming like God. It didn't force Eve to doubt the command directly. It invited her to wonder, what if there was something more? What if there was something that God had kept from them? With each word, the serpent planted a deeper seed of doubt. It didn't just question the command. It questioned God's goodness, his intentions. Why had he kept this knowledge from them? Why had he set such a boundary only to have it stand in the way of something greater, something they could understand? And in this, the serpent subtly led Eve to believe that the command wasn't about protection, but about control. That maybe, just maybe, God wasn't as good as he seemed. The fruit now seemed different to Eve. What was once just another tree in the garden had become a symbol of more. It was not just fruit. It was the means to wisdom, to enlightenment, to the kind of knowledge that could elevate her to be like God himself. The serpent had not just promised her power or wisdom. It promised a new way of seeing the world, a way that would strip away the boundaries that had once defined good and evil, a way that would free her from the limitations she had known. The allure of the fruit was no longer about the sweetness or the taste. It was about what it could bring: knowledge, understanding, and freedom from what seemed like an imposed limitation. The tree had become not just a tree but a gateway, a means to something more. As the serpent spoke, the fruit became more than just fruit. It became the gateway to a new kind of knowledge, the kind of knowledge that promised to change everything. No longer was the fruit just a command to be obeyed. It became an invitation to know something more, something beyond what God had given. The fruit was not just food, it was power. It was freedom. It was the key to becoming like God himself. The temptation then wasn't just to eat. It was to break free from what seemed like a divine limitation. The serpent didn't just offer Eve something forbidden. It offered her a new perspective, the idea that she could step beyond the boundaries that God had set. The knowledge of good and evil, a domain once reserved for God, now seemed attainable, and with it came the allure of becoming more, of becoming like God. The choice Eve faced was not just between obedience and disobedience. It was a choice between trust and self-determination. Could she trust that God's wisdom was perfect, that his boundaries were set for her protection? Or would she take the knowledge for herself and determine for herself what was good and evil? The serpent had not forced her hand. It had only subtly encouraged her to question the goodness of God's command. And in that questioning, the seed of doubt began to grow, and with it came the desire to reach for something that had been kept from her. The fruit was no longer just fruit. It was a symbol of freedom, a freedom that promised to make her like God. The serpent did not force Eve's hand. It did not demand that she eat the fruit. No, the serpent planted a question, a whisper of doubt. It asked, "Did God really say?" It didn't outright deny God's words. It simply made her wonder if God was withholding something good from her. The temptation then was not just about the fruit. It was about the desire for more. More understanding, more power, more freedom. The serpent tempted Eve with the idea that God's wisdom was limited, that there was something more to know, something she could possess. But in the desire to become like God, she would lose everything she had: trust, harmony, and the peace of the garden. The serpent's words continued to swirl around Eve, its voice smooth and inviting, weaving through the garden like a subtle wind. There was no anger, no threat in its tone, only a gentle, persuasive whisper that seemed to echo with ancient wisdom. The serpent spoke again, its eyes glimmering with calculated intelligence. "You won't die," the serpent said, its voice calm and reassuring. The words seemed to wrap themselves around Eve's heart like a warm embrace. "In fact, God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like Him, knowing good and evil." The serpent's words were not laced with immediate fear or malice. They were woven with the suggestion of something more, something hidden, something tantalizing. It wasn't just that Eve would gain knowledge. It was the promise of becoming like God Himself, to possess the kind of understanding that only the Creator had. The serpent did not promise chaos or destruction. It promised power, wisdom, and the ability to know and to see the world in a new way. It painted a picture of wisdom so grand, so vast, that Eve's heart could not help but begin to yearn for it. The fruit, which had once been just another tree in the garden, now seemed different. It wasn't merely forbidden, it was something greater, something desirable. The fruit was not a temptation because it was ugly or harmful. No, it was tempting because it was presented as a gift of enlightenment, a key to a new kind of wisdom that would elevate her to a state of understanding beyond her current limitations. The serpent didn't just tell Eve that the fruit would open her eyes. It hinted at a truth too alluring to resist: to be like God, to know what God knew, to have the power to understand good and evil. The very idea of becoming like the Creator Himself resonated deeply within Eve. It was more than curiosity, it was the allure of transcendence, of becoming more, of reaching for something that was, in her mind, the ultimate achievement. Isn't it remarkable how temptation works? The serpent didn't promise evil, nor did it threaten punishment. It didn't tell Eve that she would be harmed or destroyed. Instead, it promised wisdom. It promised the key to understanding, to knowledge, to power. The idea of being like God, to understand the depths of good and evil, to see the world from the Creator's perspective, to be elevated to a new plane of existence, was too tempting for Eve to resist. It wasn't about the fruit, it was about what the fruit represented. It wasn't just a piece of food, it was a pathway to something greater than herself. For the first time, the fruit didn't seem forbidden. It no longer appeared to be a boundary set by God, but rather a gift of enlightenment, of power, of transformation. Eve could see herself in her mind's eye, standing at the threshold of something vast, something unimaginable. To become like God, to know good and evil. To see the world not as a creation of God, but as one who could define what was good, what was evil, who could shape the world through understanding. It was a chance to step beyond the limits of her current existence, to reach beyond the boundaries set before her. It wasn't just about knowledge. It was about becoming something more. The serpent's words, so soft, so soothing, beckoned Eve toward the fruit. It no longer seemed dangerous. It seemed right. It promised truth, it promised power, and it promised a freedom that, in her mind, had been denied. It wasn't just a temptation. It was an opportunity to seize control of her destiny, to step into a role she could only dream of. The promise of wisdom, of understanding, was too much for Eve to resist. She looked at the fruit, and for the first time it seemed like a gift, not a sin. A gift to become more. A gift to become like God. The serpent's words echoed in Eve's mind, pulling her closer to the tree. She could almost feel the power the serpent had promised. The knowledge, the enlightenment, the freedom to know what was good and evil, to walk in the knowledge of the Creator. The garden around her, once a place of perfect peace, now felt small in comparison to the vastness of what the serpent was offering. The fruit, which had once seemed so distant, so forbidden, now seemed to promise everything she had ever desired: understanding, power, and the ability to be like God. And as the promise of wisdom filled her thoughts, the moment of choice drew nearer. The fruit was not just food for the body, it was food for the soul. It was the doorway to the unknown, the key to a new existence, one that could unlock all the mysteries of the universe. The serpent's words had planted a seed in Eve's heart, a seed that was beginning to grow, feeding on her desire for more, for greater understanding, for power over her own destiny. It is fascinating how temptation doesn't always come with fear, but with promise. The serpent didn't promise destruction or pain. It promised knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. The fruit was no longer just fruit. It was a gift that would elevate Eve to the level of God himself. The idea of becoming like God, of knowing what was good and evil, of becoming more than what she was, filled her mind. What was once forbidden now seemed like the key to everything she had ever longed for, to understanding, to power, to transcendence. The fruit was tempting not because it was poisonous, but because it was promising. It promised the one thing Eve had not known, what it meant to be like God. It wasn't just a fruit, it was an invitation to a higher knowledge, a higher purpose. It wasn't a sin, not yet. It was an opportunity, a doorway to be something greater, to be something more. And in that moment, Eve saw it not as disobedience, but as liberation. A chance to step beyond the limitations of the garden and into something greater. Eve stood still, her breath shallow, her heart racing. The fruit before her gleamed in the sunlight, its surface catching the rays and reflecting them like 1,000 tiny stars. It was beautiful, perhaps the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Its vibrant colors, rich and alluring, seemed to promise everything: power, wisdom, understanding. The temptation was overwhelming. The tree, which had once stood as a forbidden object in the garden, now seemed to shimmer with untold possibilities. The weight of God's command hung in the air, but it was becoming harder to remember, harder to feel the peace that had once filled the garden. With a deep breath, Eve took a step closer to the tree. The cool breeze of the garden no longer seemed comforting, but instead charged with anticipation. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of the choice before her. Time seemed to stretch as she reached out her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly, her body responding to an impulse that she couldn't ignore. She had always trusted God's wisdom, always lived in harmony with the world around her. But now she was faced with a decision that tugged at her very soul. The decision to claim what had been kept from her, to taste the fruit that promised so much more than she had ever known. Eve's hand hovered just above the fruit, her fingers trembling with uncertainty. A part of her still wondered, still hesitated, but the serpent's words echoed in her mind, smooth and persuasive. You will be like God. The promise of wisdom, of power, was too much to ignore. What if the serpent was right? What if there was more to the world than she had been told? What if God was keeping something from her? What if eating the fruit was the key to a deeper truth? Her fingers brushed the fruit, and the moment they made contact, time seemed to slow. The world around her faded. The garden, the animals, the breeze, all of it disappeared. In that moment, there was only the fruit, only the choice. Her mind and heart were consumed with the weight of what she was about to do. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the coolness of the fruit beneath her fingers, feeling the rush of thoughts and emotions. This wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a step into the unknown, a leap into a new world. The fruit beckoned her, promising to give her what she thought she needed. She took a deep breath and, without looking back, brought the fruit to her lips. As soon as the fruit touched her mouth, everything changed. The moment it touched her tongue, a flood of sensations washed over her. A rush of knowledge surged through her mind, overwhelming, dizzying, as if she were suddenly aware of everything all at once. Her senses heightened, sharper than ever before. She could hear the whispers of the leaves in the wind, the flutter of the birds in the trees, the beating of her own heart. It was as though she could see through everything, the trees, the animals, the earth itself. It was like a veil had been lifted, and she understood things she had never even imagined. The world seemed more real, more vibrant, and yet, in that knowledge, there was something unsettling. Something she had not expected. A deep, unsettling feeling began to grow within her. It wasn't the joy or the enlightenment she had imagined. No, it was something darker. It was as though a shadow had fallen over her heart, clouding the wisdom she had gained. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if something essential had been taken from her. She looked down at her body, and for the first time, she saw herself with different eyes. Her skin, once pure and untouched, now seemed fragile, exposed. She looked at her hands, at her form, and a deep, overwhelming sense of shame washed over her. She felt bare not just in body but in spirit. In that instant, the knowledge she had gained did not feel like the gift she had imagined. It felt like a burden, a weight she wasn't prepared to bear. She had crossed a line, and the very world around her seemed to have changed in an instant. It was not just her body that had changed, it was her soul. The peace that had once filled her heart was now replaced by an undeniable heaviness. The innocence she had known was gone, stripped away by the fruit she had taken. The purity she had once felt was no longer there. It was as if the garden itself recoiled in response to her choice. Eve's eyes drifted to Adam, standing nearby watching her. She saw him, but something was different. There was a distance, a shift between them. It wasn't just the space in the garden that separated them now, it was something deeper. She had taken something that was never meant for her, something that had been kept from her for a reason, and now everything was different. In that moment, everything changed for Eve. The fruit didn't just fill her mind with knowledge, it exposed her. What was once pure and innocent was now tainted with guilt. Her body, once a reflection of God's perfect design, now seemed fragile and vulnerable. For the first time, she looked at herself and saw her nakedness not as a sign of beauty, but as a reminder of her exposed soul. The innocence that had once defined her was now gone, replaced by a deep sense of shame. Eve had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had reached for what was never meant for her, and in doing so, she had broken the perfect harmony that existed between herself, Adam, and God. The fruit, which had once seemed so inviting, had promised wisdom, but instead, it had brought with it the burden of knowledge and the weight of a decision that now felt too great to bear. Her mind raced with the new understanding she had gained, but it was a wisdom that felt like a curse rather than a gift. In her pursuit of knowledge, she had lost something far more precious. Her innocence, her purity, her relationship with God. The very gift she had sought was now a burden, and the world she once knew no longer felt like home. The peace that had filled her heart was replaced by the shadow of guilt, and she felt the weight of her choice in the very marrow of her bones. Eve turned toward Adam, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't name, but one that he could feel deep in his chest. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence spoke louder than any words could. Adam saw it in her eyes, a shift, a change. She had tasted the fruit and it had changed her. He saw the fruit in her hand, the same fruit that had been forbidden. The same fruit that carried with it the weight of a command they had both known, a command they had both been entrusted to honor. The promise of wisdom and understanding was reflected in her gaze, and yet there was something else, something darker, something he couldn't ignore. The perfect harmony they had shared in the garden seemed to evaporate in the air between them, like a distant memory that no longer felt real. The peace that once existed, the purity of their relationship, was now clouded by the reality of what had just occurred. The one command they had been given had been broken, and Adam knew it. He knew the consequences. He knew that by taking the fruit, Eve had crossed a line, and now, in the depth of her gaze, she silently offered him the same choice. Adam's heart must have been torn in two. The woman he loved, the one who had been formed from his very side, had eaten from the tree that held the knowledge of good and evil. The same tree that, in that moment, had become a symbol of their disobedience. The garden, once their home, their sanctuary, now seemed distant, as if it too felt the weight of the decision that had just been made. The serenity of Eden had been shattered, replaced by something heavy, something oppressive. Eve offered him the fruit. There was no question in her eyes, no plea. It wasn't about convincing him. It was about something far more profound. Adam knew what she had done. He understood the choice she had made. And now the choice lay before him. It was a simple decision, yet it held within it the weight of all creation. Should he trust in the wisdom of God, in the one who had formed him, given him life, and placed him in this perfect garden? Should he choose to obey the command that had been given to both of them? Or, like Eve, should he reach for more, for something beyond what had been entrusted to them, to step into the unknown, to taste the forbidden fruit? Adam stood there, the fruit in his hands, and the weight of the world seemed to press down on him. He didn't need words to know what this moment meant. He understood the consequences not just for him but for all of creation. But in the face of the unknown, in the face of his own desires, Adam made his choice. Without a word, he took the fruit from Eve's hand, his fingers closing around it as though it were a lifeline, as though it would somehow answer the questions he had, the longing he had felt deep within him. He brought the fruit to his lips. And when he bit into it, the flood of knowledge overwhelmed him, just as it had overwhelmed Eve. The world around him seemed to shift. The garden, once a place of peace and perfect harmony, now felt distant, cold, and empty. The air that had once been filled with the fragrance of flowers and the songs of birds now seemed hollow. The weight of their disobedience settled on his shoulders. He had made the same choice as Eve, and in doing so he too had crossed a line. The perfect unity they had shared was gone. Their innocence was lost. The harmony of Eden had been shattered in that moment, and they had tasted the forbidden fruit, and with it they had tasted the weight of sin. Adam's heart must have been torn, for the woman he loved, the woman who had been created from his own side, stood before him with the fruit in her hand. She had already tasted the fruit, already crossed the boundary set by God. And now, without saying a word, she offered him the same choice. The same choice to trust God's wisdom, to obey his command, or to reach for more, just as Eve had done. Adam knew the consequences. He understood that by eating the fruit he too would break the command given to them by the Creator. But in that moment, standing before the woman he loved, the temptation was too great to resist. He reached out, took the fruit, and in doing so he sealed their fate. The peace of Eden, once so pure, once so perfect, now seemed distant and cold. The garden that had been their home now felt like a foreign place. Their hearts, once united in purpose, now carried the weight of their choice. The world had changed. Their innocence was gone. The harmony of creation had been shattered, and with that first bite, they had tasted the fruit of disobedience. Adam knew that by eating the fruit, he was choosing something beyond what God had given. He was choosing to define good and evil for himself, to step outside of the harmony that had once marked creation. And in that moment he realized the truth. The fruit had not only changed them, it had changed the world. What had once been pure was now tainted with sin. What had once been perfect was now broken. The moment the fruit touched their lips, everything changed. The knowledge, the understanding they had longed for flooded their minds, but it wasn't the clarity they had expected. The rush of insight was overwhelming, more than they could comprehend. Their senses were heightened, their thoughts racing, but with the knowledge came something unexpected, something darker than they could have imagined. They turned to look at each other, and for the first time they saw each other differently. Before, their nakedness had been a symbol of their perfect unity, of their innocence, a pure reflection of their unbroken connection. They had been naked and unashamed, living in harmony with themselves, with each other, and with God. But now, with their eyes open to a new understanding, their once pure nakedness felt like a burden. It was no longer beautiful, it was exposed, vulnerable. Their bodies, once a reflection of the perfection of God's creation, now seemed like a symbol of their brokenness. The weight of what they had done pressed on their hearts, and they could no longer look at each other the same way. There was no joy in their nakedness now. There was only vulnerability. Guilt crept in heavy and suffocating, and with it, shame. The harmony of the garden had been shattered, and with it, their perfect unity. Their once deep connection now felt distant, like an ache they couldn't escape. They saw themselves and each other with new eyes, eyes clouded with the knowledge of their disobedience. What had once been an effortless bond of love and trust now seemed tainted by their choice, a choice that had shattered the world around them and within them. Can you feel it? That weight in the air, the sudden heaviness that hung over Adam and Eve as they stood together in the garden? The moment when they realized what they had done, when the flood of knowledge hit them with such force that they could no longer see the world or each other as they once had. The shame that filled them was not just about their bodies. It was deeper, much deeper. It was the knowledge of their disobedience, the weight of their decision, the awareness that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Their nakedness, once a symbol of innocence and unity, now felt like a curse, an undeniable reminder of what they had lost. Their bodies, once pure and unmarred, now seemed like a veil of shame, exposed to the weight of the truth. The knowledge of good and evil had opened their eyes, but it had also opened the door to a guilt they had never known. They had tasted the fruit, and with it they had tasted the bitterness of disobedience. And now, no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't hide from what they had become. In a desperate attempt to cover themselves, Adam and Eve gathered the fig leaves from the trees. Their hands trembled as they sewed the leaves together, trying to shield themselves from each other, from the world, from God. The leaves were crude, their efforts clumsy and hasty. But no matter how hard they worked, no matter how perfectly they tried to cover themselves, the truth remained. The fig leaves could not hide the guilt in their hearts. The knowledge of their wrong had exposed them in a way that no covering could ever shield. The perfect unity they had once known was gone, shattered like glass. As they stood there, half covered by the hastily sewn leaves, they realized that no covering could hide the emptiness they now felt. Their perfect relationship had been fractured. They had crossed the line, and now the garden, once a sanctuary, felt cold and alien. The peace they had known was lost, replaced by the heavy burden of shame and guilt that weighed down their hearts. No fig leaf could cover the depths of their hearts. Their perfect union was broken, shattered by the weight of their choice. The garden, once filled with the fragrance of flowers and the music of rivers, now felt distant. It felt empty. It felt cold. What was once a place of peace was now filled with distance, with separation. Adam and Eve had tasted the forbidden fruit, but with it came something they hadn't expected. The weight of knowing, the awareness of their brokenness. The harmony they had shared was gone, and nothing they could do could erase the guilt that had now claimed them. Their bodies, their hearts, their minds were exposed to the truth of their disobedience. And as they looked at each other, their hearts filled with sorrow, they knew there was no going back. They had crossed the line. They had reached for something beyond what God had given them, and in doing so they had lost their innocence. They were no longer the untainted creatures that God had formed. They were now bound by the knowledge of good and evil, bound by their decision to step outside the harmony of creation. As they stood there, Adam's eyes met Eve's, and for the first time he didn't see her the way he had before. His heart ached as he realized that their perfect relationship, their perfect connection, had been shattered. The unity they once shared now felt fractured, like a wound that could not be healed. They had tasted the fruit, and in that moment they had tasted the weight of sin, the weight of their choice. Adam, the first man, looked at Eve, the woman created for him, and he saw her for the first time with eyes clouded by the knowledge of good and evil. The world around them, which had once been full of peace, now seemed distant, almost foreign. Their love, which had once been innocent and free, now carried the burden of shame. The moment they realized what they had done, the entire world changed. It wasn't just their nakedness, not just their bodies that had been exposed. Their hearts were laid bare, their souls were open to the weight of their sin. They could no longer see each other the same way. The perfect love they had once shared now felt distant, clouded by the shadow of guilt. The innocence that had once defined their relationship, their connection, was now gone. And no fig leaf, no matter how carefully sown, could cover the depth of their loss. The garden that had been their home now felt cold. The peace that had filled their hearts was replaced by a quiet, unsettling fear. They had crossed the line, and in doing so they had lost more than just their innocence. They had lost their perfect union, their perfect connection with God and with each other. They had tasted the fruit of disobedience, and with it they had tasted the weight of sin. As Adam and Eve stood there in the aftermath of their choice, a strange and unsettling silence filled the garden. The once perfect world, so full of life, so full of peace, now seemed different, colder, darker. Their hearts were heavy with the knowledge of what they had done, and the air around them felt thick with shame. The fruit's sweetness had faded, replaced by a deep, gnawing sense of regret. The garden, once their sanctuary, now felt like a place of exile. And then, in the midst of the silence, they heard it, a sound. The sound of footsteps, unmistakable, echoing through the garden. It was the sound of God's presence. It was a sound they had once welcomed with joy, with anticipation, with love. In the beginning, when the garden was new and their hearts were pure, the sound of God walking in the garden was a reminder of His closeness, His care, His love for them. It was the sound of companionship, of intimacy. The Creator was near, and they were free to walk with Him, to share the beauty of creation with Him. But now, as they heard those footsteps, something in their hearts shifted. What had once been a source of comfort, of peace, was now a source of fear. Their disobedience had changed everything. The harmony of the garden, the unity they had shared with God, had been shattered. And now, in the presence of the Creator, they felt exposed. They were no longer the innocent creatures who had walked in perfect harmony with God. They had tasted the fruit, and with it they had tasted the bitter reality of sin. And as God's footsteps grew louder, closer, fear began to fill their hearts. They tried to hide. They tried to cover their nakedness, their shame, with the fig leaves they had hastily sewn together. But even as they scrambled to cover themselves, they knew it was futile. There was nowhere to hide. The garden, which had once been their safe haven, now seemed vast and alien. The trees, the rivers, the very ground beneath their feet, everything now felt distant, unfamiliar. And above all, they knew that they could not hide from God. He was the Creator, the source of all life, the one who knew them completely. How could they hide from Him? How could they run from the one who had formed them from the dust, who had breathed life into them? And yet, in their shame and fear, they tried. They stumbled behind the trees, seeking cover, hoping that somehow they could escape the presence of God. But it was impossible. They were already exposed. Then came the voice of God, calling out to them in the garden. "Where are you?" God's voice was not angry. It was not filled with wrath. It was not a voice of condemnation, but one of sorrow, of longing. He called out to them not because he did not know where they were, but because he wanted them to face what they had done. He wanted them to understand the weight of their choice, the consequences of their actions. He wanted them to come to terms with what had been lost. Once, the sound of God's footsteps in the garden was a source of peace. It was a sound that Adam and Eve had longed for it meant closeness, it meant companionship. It was the sound of the Creator walking with His creation, of perfect harmony between God and man. But now that same sound filled them with fear. The moment they had tasted the forbidden fruit, everything changed. The garden, once a place of perfect unity, was now a place of separation. The peace they had once known was gone. The choice they had made now hung heavy in the air, and they knew they could not hide from the one who had made them. Their hearts raced as the footsteps grew louder, drawing nearer. The familiar sound, once so comforting, now felt like an approaching storm. The presence of God, once a blessing, now felt like an overwhelming weight, pressing down on them, exposing their guilt and shame. They could not run from Him. There was no place in the garden where they could hide. No tree, no leaf, no corner of the earth could shield them from the one who knew their hearts. And so they tried, desperately trying to cover themselves with fig leaves, but deep down they knew nothing could hide the truth. And then came the voice of the Creator calling out to them in the garden. Where are you? It was not a question born of ignorance. God knew exactly where they were. He knew exactly what they had done. But the question was not for His benefit, it was for theirs. God called out not to condemn, but to draw them out, to make them confront the truth of their choice. He asked not because He didn't know, but because He wanted them to face the gravity of their actions, to understand the breach in their relationship, and to begin the painful journey back to reconciliation. As the voice of God called out again, a deep sorrow filled the hearts of Adam and Eve. They could no longer deny what they had done. They could no longer hide behind the fig leaves, behind the illusion of covering. In the face of God's call, they could only stand exposed, not just in their physical nakedness, but in their spiritual and emotional vulnerability. They had broken their perfect unity with God, and now the consequences of their choice were fully laid bare. The voice of God, once full of peace and assurance, now brought with it a heavy weight. It was not an angry call, but one filled with sorrow and longing. It was the voice of a father calling to his children who had wandered away. Where are you? He asked, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted them to face what they had done, to confront the reality of their disobedience. He longed for them to understand the cost of their choice, the separation that now existed between them. Adam and Eve had once walked in perfect unity with God, in perfect peace. But now, with the sound of His voice, they felt exposed, vulnerable, and alone. They had crossed a line, and now there was no way to undo what they had done. They had tasted the forbidden fruit, and with it they had tasted the weight of their sin. But in that moment, God was not rejecting them. He was calling them not to condemn them, but to bring them back, to face the truth of their fall, and to begin the journey of redemption. Adam and Eve stood before God, exposed not only in their physical nakedness but in their hearts and souls. The weight of what they had done hung heavily in the air. The silence between them and God was thick, charged with the tension of what had just happened. The tranquility of Eden, the peace they had once shared with their Creator, now felt like a distant memory. The garden, once their home, had become a place of shame, and now they had to face the truth. Adam was the first to speak, his voice shaking slightly, betraying the turmoil inside him. I heard your voice in the garden, he began, his words coming slowly, as if the truth was a burden he could not fully articulate. And I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. There was no denying the fear in his voice. The words seemed inadequate, almost too simple for the enormity of what he had done. Adam's heart ached as he spoke, for in those few words, he acknowledged something more than just physical nakedness. It was the spiritual exposure that terrified him. The realization that he and Eve were no longer innocent, no longer pure in the sight of their Creator. The shame he felt was deeper than just being uncovered in the garden. It was the awareness of the brokenness between them and God. They had been given everything, yet they had chosen to step outside of God's perfect design. Eve stood beside him, her eyes downcast, the weight of guilt pressing on her chest. She too knew the truth, and when she spoke, her voice was tinged with regret. The serpent deceived me and I ate. The words were simple, but they were a confession, a quiet admission of the manipulation she had fallen prey to. But in that moment, as she spoke, it was clear to both of them that blaming the serpent was not enough. The truth was they had made the choice. The serpent had tempted, but they had taken. They had reached for what was never meant for them, and with that they had lost everything. Not just their innocence but their unity with God, their perfect harmony with creation. Though their words spoke of external influences, they both knew deep down that their disobedience was their own. They had chosen to disobey, to break the command that had been so clearly given. They were not just victims of deception, they were willing participants in their own downfall. God, in his perfect knowledge, did not need them to explain. He already knew what had happened. He knew the depths of their hearts, the true nature of their disobedience. There was no hiding from him. The truth of their actions lay bare before him, and he saw it all. His eyes were not filled with wrath or anger, but with sorrow. Sorrow for the loss of the harmony he had created, sorrow for the brokenness now present in his perfect world. Adam and Eve, ashamed of what they had done, tried to cover it with excuses. Adam blamed Eve and Eve blamed the serpent. But deep down they both knew. They had made the choice. They had reached out, taken from the tree, and in doing so, they had crossed a line that could never be undone. Their words, though laced with explanation, could not hide the truth. The truth was simple, though painful. They had chosen disobedience, and in doing so, they had lost everything. God already knew. His eyes saw through their words, through their excuses. There was no hiding from him. The truth was exposed, not just in their actions but in their hearts. Adam had chosen to eat, Eve had chosen to eat. The serpent had only suggested, but they had taken the fruit. And with that act of disobedience, they had broken the perfect harmony they had shared with God. They had tasted the forbidden fruit, and with it, they had tasted the weight of sin, the knowledge of good and evil, and the loss of their innocence. Though their words were spoken out of fear and shame, Adam and Eve both knew that their excuses were just that, excuses. The choice had been theirs. The serpent had tempted, but it was their decision to disobey. They had reached for something beyond what was given, and in doing so, they had disrupted the very order of creation. The garden was no longer a paradise, and they were no longer the innocent creatures who had walked with God in perfect unity. As Adam and Eve stood before God, the reality of what they had done settled in. The peace they had once known in the garden was now gone, replaced by the heavy weight of their sin. Their relationship with each other had changed. The bond that once united them was now tainted by guilt and fear. They had been made for each other, created in perfect unity, but now that unity was fractured, just as their relationship with God had been shattered. There was no going back. They had eaten from the tree, and with it, they had lost their place in the garden. And God, with perfect wisdom, knew it all. There was no hiding from the truth. Adam and Eve had confessed, but they couldn't hide from the reality of their choice. The shame they felt wasn't just about their bodies being exposed. It was about the brokenness of their relationship with God, the fracture in their perfect unity with each other, and the loss of their innocence. They had crossed a line, and in doing so, they had entered into a new reality, one filled with guilt, separation, and loss. Their excuses could not undo the damage they had done. God knew everything, and he saw them for what they truly were now, no longer innocent, no longer pure, but fallen. God did not need their words to understand what had happened. He already knew. And in that knowledge, he began to reveal to them the consequences of their disobedience. There was no undoing the act, no going back to the way things were. The world had changed, and so had they. God's voice rang out across the garden, but it was not the voice Adam and Eve had known. It was heavy, sorrowful, filled with a grief that was almost tangible. The Creator, whose heart had once been filled with love and joy at his creation, now spoke with the weight of sorrow. His words were not a simple condemnation. They were the inevitable result of the choices Adam and Eve had made. First, he addressed the serpent. The creature that had once slithered in the garden with its deceptive allure now stood before God, its punishment ready. "Because you have done this," God said, his voice thick with sorrow, "you are cursed more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life." The serpent, once a creature of beauty, now became a symbol of the deceit that had led to the fall. It had used its cunning to twist the truth and bring about the destruction of perfect harmony. Now it would crawl in the dust, its former grace and beauty stripped away. The curse was not just punishment, it was a reflection of the brokenness it had introduced into the world. The serpent's journey, once graceful and subtle, would now be one of degradation, its very existence a reminder of the lies it had spoken, of the evil it had unleashed upon creation. Then God turned to Eve. He spoke to her with a deep understanding of the pain she would now endure. "I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. God's words were filled with the consequences of her choice, the suffering that would follow her act of disobedience. Her pain in childbirth would be great, a reflection of the pain that her own actions had brought into the world. What should have been a joyous experience, the creation of life, would now be filled with anguish. Her very body, once free of pain, would now carry the mark of the fall. And in addition to the physical pain, there would be emotional turmoil. The unity she had once shared with Adam, the bond they had formed, would now be marred by the pain of separation. The natural harmony they once enjoyed would be replaced by a struggle for dominance, where Eve's desire would be for her husband, and yet he would rule over her. Their perfect relationship was now tainted, and their roles, once so complementary, were now marked by conflict and imbalance. God then turned to Adam, his sorrow deepening. "Because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, 'You shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life.'" The world that had once been a place of abundance would now become a place of struggle. The earth, which had freely provided all that Adam and Eve needed, would now refuse to yield its fruits easily. Adam, once the caretaker of a garden that thrived in peace, would now toil and labor, sweating and struggling for every meal. The once fertile soil would become a battleground, and the harmony of creation that had been their blessing would now be replaced by the curse of labor. The ground itself would no longer cooperate, and Adam would experience firsthand the brokenness of the world he had once ruled over with ease. The curse was not just punishment, it was a reflection of the brokenness that Adam and Eve had brought upon themselves and the world around them. The serpent, cursed to crawl on its belly and eat the dust, became a symbol of the deceit and destruction it had introduced into creation. It was no longer a creature of subtlety and beauty, but a reminder of the lie that led to the fall. Eve's pain in childbirth was not just physical, it was symbolic of the struggle and suffering that would now mark every part of her life. Her once perfect relationship with Adam, a bond of unity and love, was now fractured. Her desire would be for her husband, but the harmony they once shared would now be replaced by a struggle for dominance, a reflection of the tension and division their disobedience had brought into the world. Adam's toil in the ground was a symbol of the curse upon creation itself. The earth, which had once yielded its fruits freely, would now fight against him. The harmony of the earth was lost, and with it, the ease and peace that had marked Adam's life. His labor would be hard, his struggle constant. The world that had once been a paradise was now a place of hardship, of sweat and sorrow. The fruit of the ground would no longer come easily, and every meal would be a reminder of the curse they had brought upon themselves. Eden was lost, and with it, their perfect relationship with God. The peace they once knew in the garden had been shattered, and now they stood in the shadow of their decision, burdened by the consequences of their actions. The curse was not merely punishment, it was the natural result of their disobedience, the fracture of the perfect world God had created for them. What was once perfect was now broken, and what was once easy was now a struggle. The weight of the judgment hung heavily in the air, a heavy cloud of sorrow that enveloped Adam and Eve. The garden that had once been a place of perfect harmony now seemed a distant memory, and the peace they had once known felt lost forever. Their sin had shattered everything: their relationship with God, their perfect unity with each other, and their place in the garden. The consequences of their disobedience were clear and irreversible. The curse was upon them, and the world around them would never be the same. Yet, even in the midst of judgment, something remarkable happened. God, in His infinite mercy, spoke again. His words were not filled with anger or condemnation, but with a promise, a glimmer of hope in the darkness of their fall. He turned to the serpent, the one who had introduced the lie, who had led Eve into sin, and he declared, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." For a moment, the garden fell silent. The weight of God's words hung in the air, but within them was something the serpent had not anticipated: the promise of defeat. The serpent, who had brought so much evil into the world, would not have the final victory. God's plan would not be thwarted. There would be a battle, yes, between good and evil, a war that would rage through the ages. But in the end, the seed of the woman, a descendant, a future champion, would rise and crush the serpent's head. The serpent's power would be broken, its reign over humanity would come to an end. This was the first glimmer of hope in the midst of the darkness. For the first time since the fall, a promise of restoration echoed through the garden. God's words to the serpent were not just a declaration of victory over evil, they were the promise of redemption. The seed of the woman would come, a savior, a redeemer who would undo what had been done, who would restore what had been lost. This promise, though shrouded in mystery, was the first whisper of the coming salvation that would one day be revealed fully. In that moment, though Adam and Eve stood in the shadow of their decision, they also stood in the shadow of hope. For even though the world had changed forever, even though their perfect unity with God had been broken, there was still a promise that one day, everything would be made right. What had been lost in the garden would one day be restored. The peace, the innocence, the harmony that had been shattered by their disobedience. Even in the darkest moments of judgment, even in the face of their disobedience, God's mercy shone through. The serpent, who had deceived Eve and led them into sin, would not have the final word. God promised that the serpent's head would be crushed, that the forces of evil would one day be defeated. The battle between good and evil would rage, but the ultimate victory would belong to the seed of the woman, the promised Redeemer. In this promise, there was hope, the first light of redemption in the aftermath of the fall. God's words were not just a declaration of justice. They were a promise that the world would not remain broken, that the curse of sin would one day be lifted. What had been lost in Eden, what had been destroyed by disobedience, would one day be restored. A Savior would come, and with him would come the restoration of everything that had been lost. It wasn't the end. No, it was only the beginning. The fall was not the final chapter in the story of creation. It was the first step in a journey toward redemption, a journey that would lead to the fulfillment of God's perfect plan. The promise God gave was not just a vague hope. It was the first glimpse of a future where God's plan would unfold in ways Adam and Eve could never imagine. It would be a journey that would take millennia, but it was a journey that would lead to the coming of the Messiah, the Savior who would fulfill this promise. The seed of the woman would one day bring about the final defeat of evil, the restoration of humanity's relationship with God, and the healing of the broken world. In that moment, standing in the garden that had once been their home, Adam and Eve could not have understood the full weight of God's promise. But they knew deep down that something had changed. The world was broken, yes. But the hope of redemption had been planted, and it would grow and unfold in ways that would ultimately lead to their healing, to the healing of all creation. The curse was real. The consequences were dire. But in the midst of judgment, God's mercy shone through in the form of a promise. The promise that the serpent's reign would be defeated, that evil would not have the final victory. It was the first whisper of hope, the first inkling of redemption that would one day come through the Savior. The world, broken as it was, would not remain broken forever. What had been lost in Eden would one day be restored, and the perfect harmony that God had once intended would be brought back into being. God's words to the serpent were the first prophecy of the ultimate victory over evil, the first promise of a Redeemer who would come and bring all things back into perfect alignment with God's will. The fall was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter in which God's plan of redemption would unfold, bringing hope, restoration, and healing to the world. The weight of their choices hung over Adam and Eve as they stood before God, the finality of their punishment beginning to set in. God had spoken his judgment, and now, there was nothing left but the reality of their exile. The garden, once filled with the sound of birds, the rustling of trees, and the gentle flow of rivers, now stood silent, as if mourning the loss of its first inhabitants. With a heavy heart, God watched them as he led them away from the place he had made for them, the place of perfect harmony. The gates of Eden, once wide open to welcome them into a world of beauty, peace, and communion with God, now closed behind them. The cherubim appeared at the entrance, majestic, awe-inspiring, and terrifying in their form. Their wings spread wide, glowing with the light of heaven, and they held flaming swords to guard the way. No one could enter, no one could return. Eden was lost to them forever. As Adam and Eve walked away from the garden, their hearts were heavy with the loss. The familiar pathways, the lush trees, the sweet-smelling flowers, all of it now seemed like a distant, unreachable dream. The earth they now walked on felt hard beneath their feet, not soft and fertile as it had once been. The peace they had known, the unbroken relationship with God, was gone, and in its place was a world that seemed unfamiliar and cold. The paradise that had been their home now stood like a memory fading into the distance, something they could never return to. The sound of the flaming swords echoing behind them seemed to mark the finality of their decision. They could not undo what had been done. Their eyes, once filled with innocence and wonder, were now clouded with the awareness of the burden they had brought upon themselves. They had broken the perfect unity they had once shared with God, and now they had to live with the consequences. Separation from God was no longer a possibility, it was their reality. The perfect world they had once walked in was lost, and they were exiled from its beauty and peace. The gates of Eden closed behind them. The place they had once called home, the place where they had walked in perfect harmony with the Creator, was now shut off from them forever. The once welcoming gates now stood like a barrier between them and the paradise they had lost. The cherubim with their flaming swords stood as an impenetrable wall, guarding the way back. There was no return. The garden was lost, and with it, the innocence and peace they had known. The perfect world they had once known seemed like a distant dream. The air, once filled with the fragrance of flowers and the songs of birds, now felt heavy, thick with the weight of their sin. They had been cast out, exiled from the paradise God had given them, and now, they walked into a world that would be full of pain, suffering, and separation from the one who had created them. As they stepped away from the garden, the sounds of Eden, the soft rustle of leaves, the gentle babble of streams, the calls of animals, seemed to fade behind them. The world ahead was different. The beauty they had once enjoyed was now gone, replaced by a harsh and unforgiving reality. The peace they had shared with God was now shattered, and the closeness they had once felt was now replaced by distance. There would be no more walks with God in the cool of the day, no more conversations with their Creator, no more perfect communion with the earth. What was once a paradise was now a lost dream. As they stepped further from the garden, the magnitude of their exile began to sink in. Adam, who had once walked freely among the trees, who had named the animals and tended the garden, now walked with the weight of toil ahead of him. Eve, who had once been the companion of Adam in perfect harmony, now knew that her life would be filled with pain and struggle. The world outside Eden would no longer yield its bounty with ease, it would fight against them. The labor that would come, the suffering of childbirth, the pain of living in a broken world, it all lay before them. The shame they felt was not just the shame of their bodies being exposed, it was the spiritual exposure they now faced. The awareness of their sin, the knowledge that they had chosen their own will over God's, weighed on them heavily. The innocence that had defined them was now lost, and there was no going back. They had been exiled not just from the garden but from the intimate relationship they once shared with God. As Adam and Eve walked away from the garden, the weight of their exile pressed down on them. The garden, once so familiar, now seemed like a distant place they could never reach. Their nakedness was no longer just a physical condition. It was a spiritual nakedness, a reflection of the brokenness that had entered their hearts and souls. The innocence that had once defined them was now gone, replaced by the burden of their choice. The paradise they had walked in, the perfect peace they had shared with God, was now lost. Their perfect relationship with each other and with the Creator was shattered, and the world they now faced would be full of hardship, pain, and separation. The curse they had brought upon themselves would follow them into the world, and there would be no way to undo it. And as they walked away, the cherubim stood guarding the way back to the garden, their flaming swords a final reminder of the boundary between the paradise they had lost and the broken world they were now a part of. There was no way back. Eden was lost and they were exiled. As Adam and Eve stepped beyond the gates of Eden, the weight of their decision settled heavily upon them. The lush, vibrant paradise they had once walked in was now a distant memory. The garden, filled with abundance and peace, was gone, replaced by a world that felt foreign, cold, and uninviting. The earth, which had once yielded its bounty with ease, now felt barren and hostile, as if it too mourned the loss of its original beauty. The ground, once fertile and teeming with life, now seemed harsh, cracked, and unyielding. Adam, who had once tended the garden with joy, now found himself confronted with a labor that would be filled with sweat and struggle. The soil no longer responded to his touch with the same ease. It fought against him. Thorns and thistles would grow where there had once been abundant crops. The task that had once been a gift was now a curse. Every seed he planted, every grain of food he harvested, would come at a cost. His hands, once used to gathering fruit from trees that bore no effort, would now be covered in the dirt of toil and sweat. The sweat on his brow was not just a sign of physical labor. It was the outward sign of the spiritual labor that would now define his life. The perfect harmony he had shared with the earth and the Creator had been broken. He was no longer the carefree steward of Eden but a laborer, burdened by the consequences of his disobedience. Eve too felt the weight of the fall. She had once been created as Adam's equal, his companion, a partner in perfect harmony. Now, her relationship with him would be marked by struggle. God had told her that her desire would be for her husband, but that he would rule over her. What had once been a perfect partnership, free from tension and strife, was now marred by the desire for control, the need for dominance. The balance they once shared had been disrupted, and now their unity would be marked by a battle, a struggle for equality, for understanding, and for love. Their connection, once so pure and natural, was now affected by the consequences of their sin. But Eve's burden was not only relational. God had spoken to her of the pain of childbirth, the suffering she would now endure as she brought new life into the world. The joy of creation, which had once been a perfect and harmonious act, was now tainted by the pain of labor. Every new life would come at a cost. The pain of bringing life into the world, a direct reflection of the pain they had introduced into the world. Childbirth, once meant to be an act of creation and joy, would now be a reminder of the brokenness that their sin had caused. As they walked away from the garden, the reality of their situation settled in. There was no return to Eden, no way to undo the damage they had done. The consequences of their sin were inescapable. The earth would now be their enemy, the labor they once did in ease would be filled with sweat and pain, and the unity they once had with each other would be marked by struggle. The consequences of Adam and Eve's choices were severe, and their world had changed forever. The paradise they had known was lost. The perfect peace they once shared with God was now a distant memory, replaced by the weight of separation and guilt. But even as they faced the harsh realities of their decision, there was still hope. God had not abandoned them. He had promised that redemption was coming. Though the road ahead would be filled with pain, suffering, and toil, it was not the end of the story. God had spoken of the seed of the woman who would one day crush the serpent's head. This was a promise of restoration, a promise that, despite their fall, they would not be abandoned forever. The world, now broken, would one day be restored. Their labor would be hard. Eve would endure the pain of childbirth, a reminder of their disobedience. Their relationship, once perfect, would now be marked by conflict and struggle. But in the midst of all this, there was a promise. The seed of the woman would come, and through that seed, the brokenness of the world would be undone. What had been lost in the garden would one day be restored. Though they had fallen, though the paradise they had known was gone, they still held on to this promise. The road ahead would be long and the cost would be high, but redemption would come. It wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The seed of the woman would one day bring salvation, and through her descendants, the world would be saved. The hope of restoration was planted in that promise, and with it, the journey of redemption began. As Adam and Eve left Eden, they stepped into a world of harsh reality. The ground beneath their feet, which had once been soft and welcoming, now seemed unyielding. Adam's hands, once used for gathering the fruit of the trees, now bled with the labor of tilling the earth. Each day was marked by toil, each meal a reminder of the curse that had fallen upon them. Eve's pain was not just physical, but emotional. The joy she had once found in her relationship with Adam was now tainted by the struggle for dominance. Her relationship with him, once marked by love and equality, was now complicated by tension and desire. And with each childbirth, she felt the weight of the curse, the physical pain and the emotional burden of living in a world where every act of creation was now marked by the brokenness of sin. Yet, as the years went on, Adam and Eve began to see that the promise was not empty. Despite the struggles, despite the pain, there were moments of grace. Their children, their descendants, were born with the potential to fulfill the promise God had made. And though they had lost Eden, they had not lost everything. The world they now inhabited was broken, yes, but it was still a world filled with beauty, filled with life, filled with the potential for redemption. The story of Adam and Eve was not just a story of fallenness. It was a story of hope, of a promise that would unfold through the generations. The seed of the woman, the Savior who would come, was the hope that one day the world would be restored, and the perfect harmony that had been lost in Eden would be reclaimed. Though the consequences of Adam and Eve's sin were severe, they were not without hope. The world they now walked in was one of hardship and suffering, but the promise of redemption was still alive. The road ahead was long and full of struggle, but it was not the end of the story. God's promise remained. The seed of the woman would come, and through that seed, the world would be restored. Their labor was hard. Their relationship was marked by struggle. But through their descendants, the world would one day be saved. The promise of restoration was the thread of hope that would weave its way through the generations. What had been lost in Eden would one day be reclaimed. Though the world had fallen, the journey of redemption had begun. Though Adam and Eve's fall had cast a shadow over the world, their story did not end in despair. The world they once knew, the harmony and peace of Eden, had been lost, but in the wake of their disobedience, God's mercy shone through. His words, spoken in the midst of judgment, were not just a declaration of consequences but a promise of redemption, a hope that would echo through the generations. The serpent, who had first brought deceit into the world, had been cursed, and the seed of Eve, though hidden in mystery, was destined to crush its head. It would not be an immediate victory. The serpent's lies would continue to spread, and the battle between good and evil would rage for generations. Yet, in the midst of that struggle, there was a promise, a future hope, a savior who would come to defeat evil and restore what had been lost. The story of Adam and Eve did not end with their exile from Eden. It was not the final chapter of their lives, but rather the beginning of a much longer journey, one that would be filled with pain, suffering, and sin, but also hope. This journey would be long and filled with struggle, but the hope of redemption would never fade. From their union would come generations, their descendants, flawed and fallen, yet still carrying with them the promise of restoration. The world outside Eden was not as it had been. It was filled with toil, struggle, and pain. It was a world marred by sin and suffering, where death had entered, and where the consequences of their choice were felt by all of creation. But even in the midst of that, God had not left them without hope. The promise he made to Eve, that her seed would crush the serpent's head, became the thread of hope that wove through the fabric of time, bringing salvation to a broken world. For Adam and Eve, the journey forward would be long. The road ahead would not be easy, and it would be filled with hardship and suffering. They would witness the pain of their children, the tears of loss, the struggles of life in a fallen world. And yet, the hope of redemption would continue to echo through the ages. From the seed of the woman, a savior would be born, a redeemer who would one day restore all things. And though Adam and Eve could not see it in their lifetimes, the promise that God had made would one day be fulfilled. The fall of man was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The promise of redemption, spoken in the garden after the fall, would be carried through the generations. It was the first whisper of salvation, the first light in the darkness. The seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, and though the battle between good and evil would unfold over time, the victory was assured. The road ahead would be long, filled with pain, sin, struggle, and suffering, but it would also be filled with hope. A hope that would never fade, no matter the darkness of the world. The Savior would come. And with him, he would bring the redemption that had been promised. He would restore what had been lost, heal what had been broken, and bring about a new creation where peace and harmony would once again reign. The fall had begun the journey of separation, but the promise of God began the journey of restoration. The world would be changed forever, but God's plan of redemption had already been set in motion. And so, the journey began, a journey that would stretch over millennia, that would bring pain and suffering, but that would also bring the fulfillment of God's ultimate promise, the redemption of the world, the restoration of what was lost, and the hope of salvation through the coming Savior. As the story of Adam and Eve unfolded across the generations, the hope of redemption was passed down, even in the darkest of times. Their descendants, though burdened by the same fallen nature, would carry the seed of hope in their hearts. Through the line of Eve, the Savior would be born, the one who would finally undo the curse, defeat sin and death, and restore the perfect harmony of Eden. And so, the journey of hope began. Adam and Eve, though they had fallen, were not without hope. Their choice had brought them pain and separation, but it had also brought about the first glimpse of God's incredible mercy and redemption. In their fall, they found the first flicker of a light that would lead the world toward healing. Their redemption was already promised, and the story of that redemption would echo through history until it was fully realized in the coming of the Savior. The fall was not the end. It was the beginning of a long journey, one that would carry the weight of sin and suffering, but also the promise of redemption. The seed of the woman would come, and with him, he would restore all things. The road ahead was filled with pain and struggle, but it was also filled with the hope that one day redemption would come. And so, the story continued, the story of mankind, of sin, but also of hope, of a promise that would one day be fulfilled. If you've enjoyed this journey through the story of Adam and Eve, and the powerful promise of redemption that echoes through generations, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who might need to hear this message of hope. Every like helps us reach more people, and it lets us know that these stories are making an impact. And if you want to keep following along with more stories like this one, full of hope, wisdom, and the promise of restoration, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, we're sharing these timeless truths, and we'd love for you to be part of the journey. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.